In this presentation, I want to introduce you to the analytical technique known as analysis of competing hypotheses. This process is important in trying to work out trying to find explanations for different issues or events that might be taking place. A hypothesis is a explanation or a question that you're posing that needs to be answered. So when you make hypotheses, it can be in the form of a question, or it can be in the form of a statement, but ultimately you're wanting to test it. An hypothesis needs to be tested to see whether it's true or false. And so the analysis of competing hypotheses is one way that we can test a hypothesis or multiple hypotheses. And that's what we'll cover in this short presentation. So some of the main things that we will look at is what exactly is an analysis of competing hypotheses. We'll look at why we use them, what are their benefits, and then we'll finally have a look at the way that they're constructed as a means for you then to go and try and construct one yourself on the Interact site. So let's have a look. So like all structured analytical techniques, it's really about allowing us a format and an ability to think in a structured way about theories or causations, what might be, or explaining on what might be taking place. So it allows us to think through the hypotheses in a clear manner and gets our thinking clear. It gives us the opportunity to articulate that there are possible multiple explanations for an event or issue, and we can then weight on which one of those hypotheses are more likely than the others. It also allows us to make sure we have evidence for our explanations, and so we use evidence to formulate and test rather our hypotheses, and so it brings the importance of evidence into testing them. And finally, it can also aid in further collection. It can highlight gaps in what we know, and it can direct us towards where we might need to find more information. And so, again, it's a clear, structured way for us to develop explanations for what's going on. So we use them. We use them to avoid myopic thinking, that is narrow-mindedness. There's a tendency for analysts to sometimes get a mindset about what they think is going on and what the reasons are for those events or issues, and stick to that, and then begin to look at evidence to support that opinion, rather than try and test or entertain new hypotheses and new approaches that we may not have thought of before. So it gets rid of, I guess, a form of cognitive bias, if you will, or a form of looking at the world just through your own lens. This encourages us to look wider and entertain other ideas. And again, it helps us so we're not making those assumptions, and when we do make those assumptions, they're on evidence and they're not on an impression, which sort of goes on for my initial point. And we made the point of allocating resources. If we can come up with a hypothesis, a reasonably solid one, then we know that that is most likely happening, so we can allocate resources to that hypothesis and further investigation or whatever is required. And finally, we also look at where there is a lack of data or a lack of evidence to support any hypothesis as well. So by using the analysis of competing hypotheses, we are able to do a number of things: get our thinking right, avoid assumptions, allocate resources, and identify where there's lack of data. They're just a few of the reasons on why we might want to use one. So how are they constructed? I'll show you a diagram in a moment, but essentially it's really about drawing a matrix with the hypothesis up the top in columns. Down the left-hand side, you then list the evidence. The evidence can either be listed on the side and then with pluses where it fits in with the hypothesis, or as I'm going to show you in a moment, you can just put them directly in the column under the relevant hypotheses. So let me show you and we'll have a look. Now this one comes from the text, and the hypothesis for this was what are the causes of the heroin shortage in Sydney? And this comes from the text. And when approaching this, we have 4 hypotheses here. But in initial stages of development, it's quite okay to sit down and list many more hypotheses. So the best thing to do is to begin with a brainstorming session on what you think's likely happening and getting them all down. Then once you've got them all down, you put them across the top of that column, as you can see. And in this instance, we've got 4 that have been come up with. Recent seizures by law enforcement, significant arrests, water shortages in Myanmar, and enforcement of opium cultivation in Afghanistan. They're the 4 hypotheses that have been brought out on this. Now, once you've done that and you've laid out your hypotheses, you then start to go through the evidence. And you start to look for evidence that would support, or better still, discount those hypotheses. Some schools of thought advocate that you want to try and prove a hypothesis wrong first rather than try and prove it right. The reason is so we don't get caught up in trying to prove our own perceptions. So by trying to disprove is another approach. But for the moment, we're looking here at, they're looking for evidence to support the hypothesis rather than discount it at this moment. So the first bit of evidence, E1 there, we see, well, we've gathered some data there about Australian law enforcement seizures of heroin. In the hypothesis 2, or the evidence rather 2, we know that there's been some arrests that have taken place. And evidence 3 is data on production rainfall, shows that there is a reduction in rainfall in Myanmar, therefore a reduction in production. In evidence 4, we see that there's quantitative data on drug production. 5 talks about another reduction in the actual growth of opium. And the 6th bit of evidence is police intelligence that heroin that was destined for Australia has ended up going to Europe to fill in that market. So there are different bits of evidence that we've come up with, and we've assigned them to where they fit under each of those hypotheses. So when we talk about seizures, we have some information about that. Talk about the arrests, well, yes, it's based on evidence that we do have some arrests. In the 3rd, we've got the rainfall, and plus we've got police intelligence. We've got 2 pieces of evidence there, and we've also got 2 pieces of evidence for the 4th one as well. So by looking at this, and this is very superficially, we can say, well, we've got 2 bits of evidence for hypothesis 3 and 4. So those hypotheses, these are going to be stronger, are likely going to be stronger than hypothesis 2 and 1. And so we would begin to move towards looking at those. Clearly, based on this example, there's not much evidence to really make any final judgment. So the takeaway for this would be that in a lot of instances we require more evidence to either support or discount hypothesis 3 or 4. And you begin building from that point. So that's a really brief overview of doing the analysis of competing hypotheses. And there are, as I say, there's more in your text that explains it, and on the Interact site there's a short video that will assist as well. We will cover this in a bit more detail during our tutorials, but for now there's an activity on the Interact site down the bottom of this topic that gives you an opportunity to try and do one for yourself.